Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here. Thank you for Irena to inviting me, for Jeffrey for this wonderful introduction. I especially agree without any irony with that very precise point about dogmatics. I think that, and especially I would even go a step further and say dogmatics in the theological sense in the word. Why? Maybe it will become clear from what I will be saying. So let me go to the point. But nonetheless, I hope you will not be too disappointed, because it will not be only jokes in what I will be saying. Okay, let me begin in a very traditional way with a big question. What can philosophy do today? What can it tell the general public haunted by the problems of ecology, racism, religious conflicts, and so on? I think that the task of philosophy is not to provide answers, but to show how the way we perceive a problem can be itself part of a problem, mystifying it instead of enabling us to solve it. There are not only wrong answers, there are also wrong questions. These wrong questions are what we call ideology. When we are dealing with a problem, which is undoubtedly a real problem, the ideological designation or perception introduces its inevitable mystification. So again, when people ask me ecology or war, what can we do? Well, I don't know. What I can do as a philosopher is just to analyze how we perceive the problem. Let me take the example of tolerance. I'm opposed to this notion. I think it's a pseudo-notion. Now, of course, the immediate reaction of well-meaning liberals is, but how can you be for intolerance towards foreigners? How can you be for anti-feminism, for homophobia, and so on and so on? But this is the catch. Of course, I'm not for intolerance towards foreigners, for anti-feminism, and so on. What I am against is the perception, which is today more or less automatic, of racism as a problem of tolerance. Make a simple experiment. I did make it. Go and check on the web Martin Luther King's speeches. If there is a great figure of anti-racist fight, of course it's Martin Luther King. You will see that the word intolerance is practically absent there. For Martin Luther King, one doesn't fight racism with tolerance, but with what? Emancipatory political struggle, even armed struggle. So, why are so many problems today perceived as problems of intolerance rather than problems of inequality, exploitation, injustice, and so on? You see my point. That's for me the problem. Racism is a problem, but to perceive racism as problem of tolerance, it's not automatic. In this innocent shift of perspective, there is ideology. Why? I claim the reason is the liberal, multiculturalist basic ideological operation, the, let's call it, culturalization of politics. Political differences, differences conditioned by political inequality or economic exploitation, are naturalized, neutralized into cultural differences. That is, into different ways of life, which are something given, something that cannot be overcome, so they can only be tolerated. The cause of this culturalization is the retreat, the failure of direct political solutions such as welfare state or various socialist projects. Tolerance is their post-political ersatz. And I think the same goes for harassment, another heavily connotated ideological term. Again, of course, I am very much against brutal harassments like rape, bigotry, and so on and so on. The problem is that in today's ideological space, real harassments, their perception, is irreducibly intertwined with the narcissistic notion of an individual who experiences all proximity of others as an intrusion into his or her private space. So I claim that the way we, in the so-called highly developed Western countries, if you look closely how we effectively use the word tolerance, I claim it de facto as a rule means its exact opposite. Tolerance means don't harass me. Don't harass me means don't come too close to me, you know, like, are you washed, desodorants, don't smoke. And in other words, tolerance means I am intolerant towards your over proximity to me. Tolerance means don't come too close, stay at the proper distance. So ideology is, in this precise sense, a notion which, while designating a real problem, blurs a crucial line of separation. Okay, another of such classical ideological notions today, I think, is this celebration pseudo-Deleuzian of nomadic existence and so on and so on. Why? Because instead of enabling us to draw the crucial distinction, it blurs it. It brings together, under the same cover, nomadic existence, two totally different phenomena. One is the nomadic existence of, well, to be frank, somebody like me, and probably upper middle class intellectual, traveling nicely, sometimes with upgrades and so on, even business class. But then, you know, to put me together with, let's say, to be a little bit pathetic, a third world person, refugee from a war-torn or starved country or starved population, and claim we are both nomadic. It's a little bit like, to quote Gayatri Spivak, to take a rich fat lady who is dieting and a starving third world woman and say they're basically doing the same thing, eating less than. This ideology of tolerance can be reduced to the motto, love your neighbor as yourself. However, as we learned from Freud, neighbor is not simply another person with a rich inner life filled with stories she or he is telling himself, herself. This is the counter-revolution attacks, or what? Enemy never. You see? I told you. Okay. This is what in Lacan we call intervention of the real and so on. Okay, let's go on. It's usually when we say neighbor, multiculturalist ideology tells us, yes, we should know the other from within. We should not objectivize the other. The premise of liberal tolerance is thus that such a person whom we know from within cannot ultimately be an enemy. Or, to quote a well-known motto, which I totally oppose, incidentally, but it sounds so sublime, so deep. An enemy is someone whose story you have not heard. Okay, there is a nice literary example known to all of us, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. It is true, Mary Shelley does something that a conservative would never have done. In the central part of her novel, she allows the monster to speak for himself, to tell the story from his own perspective. Her choice expresses the liberal attitude towards the freedom of speech at its most radical. Everyone's point of view should be heard. In Frankenstein, the monster is not a thing, a horrible object no one dares to confront. He is fully subjectivized. Mary Shelley moves inside his mind and asks, what is it like to be labeled, defined, oppressed, excommunicated, even physically distorted by society? The ultimate criminal is thus allowed to present himself as the ultimate victim. The monstrous murderer reveals himself as a deeply hurt, desperate individual yearning for company and love. Now, along these lines, practicing this noble motto of multicultural tolerance, the authorities in Iceland, Reykjavik capital, but also now I heard in some other European countries, maybe even here in the United States, I don't know about it, they are recently imposing a unique form of enacting this subjectivization of the other. In order to fight the growing xenophobia, the result of the greater and greater number of immigrant workers in Western Europe, as well as sexual intolerance, they are organizing what is called living libraries. Members of ethnic or sexual minorities, gays, immigrant East Europeans or blacks, are paid to visit an Iceland or British or German family and just talk to them, acquainting them with their way of life, their everyday practices, their dreams, and so on. In this way, the exotic stranger who was perceived as a threat to our way of life appears as somebody we can empathize with a complex world of his or her own. So this sounds very nice. What's the problem? The problem is let's take this noble motto, an enemy is someone whose story you have not heard, and do something very vulgar, in the sense of British empiricism. Let's just replace the general name with a concrete example. Would you also say Hitler was our enemy because we did not really try to hear his story? And the problem is deeper here than it may appear. Namely, the automatic presupposition which we should abandon is that the story we are telling ourselves about ourselves, our inner, authentic self-experience, is the point of truth. As if you humanize the other, if you get him at his or her or their innermost, then you can say this is what they truly are. But I think that this precisely, if there is a lesson of psychoanalysis, is that this precisely is what we should radically abandon. If from what we know about Hitler, if we take again the worst example, one of the worst, Hitler, I think that even for him probably, the same as Hannah Arendt claimed for Eichmann would have hold. Probably he was, as we know from the memories of his secretary who died only 2 years ago or when, he could have been quite kind, compassionate, he liked to serve cakes to small children and so on, gentle vegetarian and so on. And I'm even quite sure that he was absolutely sincere in this. This is the important lesson of Hannah Arendt. That people who cause great evil, we should not elevate them into sublime, Byronesque, demoniac figures of evil. The gap between their intimate experience and the horror of their acts is always immense. So again, the experience we have of our lives from within, the story we tell ourselves about ourselves in order to account for what we are doing, is fundamentally a lie. That's not the point of truth. So let me give you two extreme examples which I already developed in some of my earlier books. One Western, one Eastern. The West, Père Joseph. You maybe know who he was. The grey eminence of Cardinal Richelieu. And you should maybe read the book Aldous Huxley, The Grey Eminence, about Père Joseph. What fascinated Aldous Huxley so much about Père Joseph? It's that he was, well, the most brutal real politician that you can imagine. Organizing kidnappings, torture, dark plotting. He's basically the guy, if we simplify history, who is responsible for Hitler. You know, in one sense. In the 30 Years' War, 1618-1648 in Europe, he was the one who made a pact between Catholic France and Protestant Sweden against, Catholic Austria in order to weaken Germany, to prevent the reunification of Germany. He succeeded. The result was the German deferral of reunification, which was the structural condition for Hitler. Okay, the worst guy you can imagine. But there is something quite fascinating. After he did this dirty work every evening, metaphorically, almost every evening, he was in permanent conversation, exchange of letters with some French convent with nuns, and the exchange of letters demonstrates that he was practicing mystic, this same Père Joseph, and you cannot escape the conclusion. His mystical meditations are, how should I put it simply, top of the top, absolutely at the level of Saint Teresa, of whatever you want. And this is what fascinated Huxley. How is it possible that the same person who was ruthless, lying, poisoning, brutality itself, at the same time demonstrates a breathtakingly deep spiritual strength? Huxley's solution was a very simple one, was that there must be something in Western Christianity which enables this, opens up the possibility of this deviation. He thinks it's too much fixation on pain, fascination with the figure of Christ on the cross. So Huxley's solution, let's turn to Eastern spirituality. But there I think the story is the same. I read a book which I often quote,